So,
great.
Welcome to my two lovely ladies who are on the phone with us, and perhaps Angel will join us. I just want to, take a moment to just, kind of bring us into this space of learning, a space of creating that openness for new ideas and for new understandings, and also a space for really embracing sacred work and the sacred responsibility we have to provide a safe environment, a safe congregational space for our children, for our youth, and for all of our people. So welcome to our webinar tonight. I'm going to just introduce kind of some big ideas. Beth is going to introduce us to some basic safety policies. I didn't introduce myself because I know both Carol and Christina, and I think they know you as well, Beth.
Probably.
I don't know if they need to know more about your background. She's a triple threat. Beth is a triple threat for us, which we really appreciate, meaning that she has religious education experience, and she's an associate credentialed religious educator, and she was a nurse, and she's also our administrative expert on insurance and liability. So she's really an important partner in this conversation. So she's going to introduce us to kind of the basics. I'm going to talk a little bit about creating policy and some of the things to think about as we do the work of creating policy, or even, sort of re-looking our policy, re-energizing, revitalizing the conversation around safety in a broader sense. Beth is going to talk a little bit about disaster preparedness and thinking about the unthinkable. I'm going to talk about some ways that we can introduce conversations around the sexual health of our congregations. I hope that we'll have some question and answer time. We came up a little short this morning, but we're gonna try to quicken our pace a wee bit so that we can leave time. And it's a small group, so feel free to offer questions and resources, stories, comments in the chat box, and we'll try to address them as we go. So we're due to be done around 8:30, and here we go. So just to start out, sort of what does it mean to be safe? And the interesting thing is that many of us have different ideas about what is safe and what isn't safe. There are some stories that come out of our cultural backgrounds. We have stories that come out of our family backgrounds. Sometimes it depends on our age. When you think about something like car seats for children and for babies, when I was growing up, we were all just tumbling around the back. We barely even had seat belts. And yet the idea of what is safe for a child of that age in a car has changed dramatically over the last few decades. As has, sort of the conversation around what's not safe. I think that safety for many of us going back several decades used to be really focused more on physical safety. We were more concerned about, the scary things out there, the scary and unusual things that maybe happened to somebody else. And now with, there's been so much has changed in our world, in our culture. Some things for the better and some things not for the better. One of those things is that we just have more information. So we hear things. We didn't used to know that, I get daily updates from a local neighborhood watch app about the sex offender that lives, in the next town over. And we didn't used to have that information almost assaulting us on a regular basis. And so there's a lot more that we have to think about, and our idea of what is safe and what is unsafe has shifted. And there's sometimes there's a little bit more fear about safety, and in some cases there's a little bit more leniency, because we have such a sexualized culture that there are things that would have been unacceptable 20, 30, 40 years ago that now are things that we kind of take for granted. And I think you can, if you reflect on that a little bit, you can probably come up with, a couple of things. Just think about advertising, the way, young girls in particular are often depicted in advertisements. That would not have been appropriate. Society wouldn't have been acceptable a generation or two ago. And now, anything goes. So we're going to think about safety, the bigger picture of safety, from kind of four different perspectives. One idea is physical safety, and I think most of us understand that. That's about seatbelts, and it's about two adults in a classroom. It's about sharp edges and plugs in plastic little plugs in the outlets, those kinds of things. It's about our parking lot. It's about putting our de-icer on our walks. So there's a piece of safety that's concerned with the physical pieces. There's also an emotional piece of safety and how we look at safety and how we think about safety in our congregation. So one of the things that brings people to church, and perhaps particularly to a Unitarian Universalist congregation, is this idea that it's a place where I can explore. It's a place where I can make myself vulnerable. It's a place that's inclusive of many different possible understandings of our sort of our faith and our way of being. So there's an assumption that church is an emotionally safe place, but we all know that assumptions aren't always reflected in our practice and in the reality that we're living. Another piece is relational safety. So this is the piece of how we are together. And as a covenantal faith, we lift up that relational piece. That carries a lot of weight in our Unitarian Universalist congregations. We're concerned with how we engage with one another. We talk about being in right relationship. We talk about balance of power in relationships. So that's a piece that's really important to us. So we need to consider that when we think about what safety means for us. The final piece is sexual safety, and this is certainly a place that has occupied a lot of headlines in the last 10 or 15 years. More so in some of the larger denominations, certainly in the Catholic faith, many stories of abuse and inappropriate behavior. But those stories are also very alive in our congregations as well. Stories of inappropriate behavior on the part of staff or ministers in congregations. So that's a part of what we need to be considering when we're thinking about creating a safe space. So again, bigger picture, when we think about sort of how we are engaging with this question of what is safe, what does it mean to offer a safe congregation? There are certainly legal definitions, and those are important. There are real liability concerns. So there's a legal aspect to providing us to claiming and working towards a safe congregation. There's also the moral piece. So safety is, for many of us, we have an ethical framework that tells us that in certain situations that something is very right or something is very wrong. And so we have to balance that when we think about what makes our congregation safe. And then finally balancing that with the covenantal piece, how we are with one another. So all three of these things come into play when we think about creating a safe religious education program and creating a safe space within our congregation, really for all ages. It's this balance between our covenantal commitments, our moral understandings, and the legal requirements and obligations that we have. It's also important to think about who in our congregation is vulnerable. You know, when we are paying attention to creating this safe space, who is that work for? Who are we really concerned about? Certainly, we're concerned about the young. There is a power dynamic between a child or a youth and an adult that is pretty clear. The adult holds the power. The adult is often the authority figure. The adult has the experience and the understanding, and they have a physical, often a physical dominance over children as well. So, in terms of how we think about who's vulnerable, sometimes we have to think about that power balance. Elders are very much at risk in our world, in our society today. There are a growing number of, certainly, baby boomers are beginning to move into their retirement years. There are some new understandings of some of the kinds of physical, emotional, and psychological changes that happen with our elders. And so they have become very much an at-risk population. And many of our congregations have a very gray population. That's, for better or for worse, that's where we are as a broader denomination. We have many folks in the over 55 category. So that's a growing concern in our congregations. Other folks who are vulnerable, those who are physically challenged, those for whom our spaces and maybe our conversations are not accessible. Those things are they're vulnerable. And then sort of the kind of the hidden vulnerable populations are folks that are marginalized in our congregation. Anybody who is not part of the dominant, either racial, gender, or cultural group in a congregation, maybe somebody who's not part of the dominant socioeconomic or educational group, or anybody who has a different theology, whose theology is different. Those folks are subject to not feeling entirely safe and in expressing their feelings and expressing their opinions, in sharing their understandings of their theology. So when we think about safety and safe congregations, we need to think basically about almost everybody in our congregation is vulnerable. And the UUA.org, they have, some words around what safe congregations is all about. But if you check out UUA.org, you can see that they consider issues like, I can't even read that, it's so small. Responsible staffing, trauma. There's a number of different things that come under this heading of safe congregations, and we'll spend a little bit more time talking about that. So that's our little introduction, and now we're going to get a little bit more specific. Turn it over to Beth.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about basic safety policies and tips. Some of this is going to seem like common sense. If you've been a parent or you currently are a parent of a small child, you're thinking, well, heck, that's what I do in my own home. Why wouldn't I do it there? But if you've not had the experience with small children, or you've we're a distance away from that, this is just some reminders. And these are also some things you may not have thought of. I am a pediatric nurse. I'm certified in pediatrics. I'm still licensed and certified in pediatrics, even though I don't actively work in that field. And I know that we did this in the hospital I worked in. So a lot of this stuff was required there. So it's really important, and it should be everywhere. So here's the things I wanted to hit on. Basic infant and toddler safety. So this is the things we all kind of think about. The outlet covers that you pop in so that the kids can't stick their fingers in the outlet and shock themselves. And I know these are really common in RE programs in the room that the children are in, but I'm going to talk a little bit about thinking outside that room a little bit in a few minutes. The doorknob covers for the inside of the room on a toddler room are probably important because, the two teachers turn their back to deal with another child, and the next thing you know, someone's out in the hall. So that's something you may want to consider. This has been a law for several years, but blinds with breakaway pools, there was a rash of children choking and strangling themselves because the cords on the blinds were a continuous loop, and they'd stick their heads through it and get caught when they fell. And so there's now a federal law that anything manufactured like that has to have a piece of plastic on it that pops two pieces apart so that if any pressure on them. However, if your blinds were put up a long time ago, that's something you might want to investigate and see. And if your blinds are the old style, you may want to cut them or make sure they're looped up over the top so that the kids can't get a hold of them. You need to check that your age-appropriate toys are regularly inspected and cleaned. Age-appropriate toys are somewhat of a challenge. I just had a grandson. He's like 3 months old. We were going to see him in Korea over Christmas break. My mother-in-law, bless her heart, wanted to keep buying things that say very plainly on them, only appropriate for children over the age of 3. And she kept saying, well, you guys played with these. We're like, yeah, and there's a reason why they don't let little kids play with them anymore. So you need to check to make sure your toys are appropriate for the age group that you're providing them for. And I can tell you that my children knew it was the start of the new RE year because we would spend half a day at the RE building running, gathering up anything that could go through the dishwasher. So someone just pointed out that can happen, yes. And also then, doing a bleach water and cleaning everything that couldn't go through the dishwasher. And so, that's one of those things you need to pay attention to. Also, check your donated toys and furniture. Donated toys could be broken, and so you need to double check them to make sure that they're actually appropriate. And furniture may not meet the current safety standards. This happened, I know, a long time ago. The crib size went away, the slat difference, the space between the slats and the cribs changed right after my kids were born, because kids would get their heads caught between the slats. And a lot of people bought new cribs and donated their cribs to their nursery school or their play group or their church. And then all of a sudden we had all these churches with their inappropriately sized openings and the kids getting caught there. So you need to double check that what's being donated to you does meet current safety standards. And as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about safety guards. Safety guards should extend beyond the RE space. When I was a DRE, I realized that my youngest children spent an awful lot of time in the fellowship hall. And I campaigned like crazy to do outlet covers in the fellowship hall. And it actually took someone else catching a child trying to stick his fingers in the outlet, he was about 3, before I won that battle. But, that's something to pay attention to. Our children don't just exist in the RE space. They exist all over the building, and we need to pay attention to that. And one thing I do tell people to do if you're trying to figure out what's hazardous to a child in this room, if you sit on the floor in the middle of the room, that puts you at about eye level of the child, you will see hazards that attract them. You will see the stuff hanging off the table or off the bookcase. You will see how enticing things look. And then you can kind of get an idea of what you need to do to make the space safer. I also would suggest that you have a first aid kit in your RE space somewhere, and then there should always be one in the kitchen. That's another place there should always be in your church. And first aid training should be part of your RE training. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, you don't have a health professional in your in your congregation you can rely on for that. You might want to check with your local fire department or Red Cross or local hospital. Many places offer basic first aid training for little or no cost, and they might be willing to come out and do a training for you. And, it's definitely important that teachers understand how to deal with some basic emergencies in their classroom. And also just the general, do you have smoke detectors and fire extinguishers? And if you do you A, check them, and B, do you use them? And do you know how to use them? Because that's often a problem that we have, is that people don't know how to use fire extinguishers. I'm going to hit on a couple of specific areas next. Playgrounds. And you may not have a playground. Oh, yeah, Pat just mentioned that teens volunteering in the nursery should have first aid training too, and that is true. Anyone who's working with the children should have that training. So playgrounds. You may not have a playground, but if you do, you need to check your equipment regularly for repairs. It's outside. It's getting exposed to the weather. It's going to deteriorate. You need to have good supervision policies. Your ratio of child to adult in the classroom should extend to the playground. Just because they're on the playground out in public doesn't mean your ratio changes. You should ensure that the equipment is appropriate for the age group that's using it. Check the surfaces regularly for rocks and glass. And also check your state and local regulations. Some local regulations now require that all playgrounds have a fence around them so that children can't access them without an adult. So you need to pay attention to what your local state and your state and local regulations are with relationship to playgrounds. You also need to check with your insurance company because there are lots of regulations around playgrounds. Playgrounds have become a hot liability area, and so there's a lot of regulations around that. And your insurance may actually go up if you have one. And also, if you have the situation where you are sharing your space with a playgroup that's asked to put a playground on your property and the playground belongs to them, you need to make sure that that use of that playground is covered under your insurance for your time, even though it's not your playground, because if it's not, you may not be able to use it. You may have to restrict access to it. Another area of a lot of concern, and I get a lot of questions on, is transportation. We transport youth, particularly to cons and other activities. Sometimes we transport younger children if we're doing field trips. When you're transporting, drivers should be 25 or older. And if you think about it, that's the age you have to be to rent a car for most rental agencies, so there's a reason for that. You need to make sure the vehicles are maintained. I made this comment this morning. The state of Ohio does not have annual vehicle inspections, so, cars could be driven on the road until the state police choose to check them out on their own purview. So, do an eyeball over the vehicle and see if it looks safe to you. Make sure all the seatbelts work. That's one of the big keys. Everybody should have a seatbelt, and all the seatbelts that they're using should work. Please avoid 15-passenger vans. This was a hot topic about 5 or 6 years ago. There were a number of rollovers involving college teams. 15-passenger vans, when not fully loaded, actually are inappropriately balanced. And it causes all kinds of problems. They're a huge accident risk. Many insurance companies will not cover them anymore, whether you rent one or you own one. So you need to pay attention to 15-passenger vans. I know it makes transporting a large group much easier. And work with your insurance company to ensure that you have covered all your bases. There are things you can do to make them safer. So that's one of the things if you have to use one to check. You should have a procedure. What happens when there's an accident? And people driving should know this. Who are they supposed to call? What are they supposed to do? What's the procedure if there's an accident? And you also should know that every driver in the cars should have a copy of the children they're carrying in their cars, medical release form and permission forms. You don't have to have the originals. If you want the originals to stay with one person, they need to have a copy of the kids who are in their vehicle. Because if they got separated, if they have an accident, they're going to need that information on site when that happens. So, some basic tips about transportation. And the other thing I'm going to talk about are liability issues. One of the reasons safety's become a bigger topic is because more people are suing over this kind of stuff. So here's some things I've learned over the years working with various insurance companies. Safety policies are essential. You need to have them. Policies tell people what to do, and that's why they're important. It gives people an idea of what they're supposed to do. However, it's a really fine line that you walk when you're dealing with safety policies. On the one hand, legally, it is worse not to follow your own policies and procedures than not have one. So if you've got a policy manual that's sitting on the shelf that nobody has any idea what's in it and nobody's doing what is said in it, you have a problem, because you're probably not following your policies. And as soon as somebody gets hurt and they sue and you start looking at the policy, that's the first thing they're going to ask you. The insurance company is going to ask if you have a policy when something happens. So that's a big deal. But on the flip side, not having policies for what's considered the bare basics that is an expectation everybody have can be equally problematic legally. So for example, if you don't have policies about having a certain number of ratio of adults to children and in the classrooms, and you don't have policies about some basic safety things, that's going to create a problem for you as well, because that's an expectation that everybody's going to have that. So there's a fine line you have to walk between the two. You do need to educate folks so that they follow your policies and procedures. So during your teacher training, you need to make sure you talk to the teachers about the policies that affect them. The same would be true with your youth group leaders, all of those sorts of things. And laws differ, so check your local and state laws to ensure you're in compliance. I can give you general stuff, but specifics vary widely. Also consult with your insurance company. Insurance companies are a great resource. They provide a lot of resources because they want you to think and be proactive. However, here's a warning. If you send or ask your insurance company to review a policy and give you feedback on it, they are not going to tell you, oh yes, this is perfect, put it in place, or no, this is not good. They may offer some suggestions, oh, you don't need to get that specific, or they may say, you know what, this is missing, but they're not going to tell you this is the perfect policy. Because if something were to happen and then you wanted coverage and they decided it wasn't coverable for some reason, you could come back to them and say, hey, you said this was the perfect policy. We were just following what you said. So they're trying to cover themselves. So they'll give you general advice, but they will not give you specifics. So just be aware of that. And here are some basic important policies you need to consider. Ratios of children or youth to adults. So these are some pretty standard ratios. I've looked in a lot of different places. This is what Girl Scouts uses. This is what a lot of other organizations use. So this is a good thumbnail ratio. Infants is 1 to 4. That's a daycare requirement, is 1 to 4 for infants. Toddlers is up to age 5 is 1 to 6. School age children through 8th grade is 1 to 8. High school youth is 1 to 10. But local laws can lower these ratios. In the Ohio-Meadville district, which is where I work part of my time, we use a 1 to 10 ratio for our youth cons and a 1 to 6 for our junior high cons. We have to use 1 to 6 for one of my churches because they're in an area where the ordinance is that you can't have a ratio of higher than 1 to 6, even for anyone up to 18. So we have to have a 1 to 6 ratio in that church, even when it's a senior high conference. So do check your local laws. We talk about having 2 teachers in the room, but one piece that very few people normally talk about is that they should be unrelated. And there's a reason for that. They should not be a parent and a child. They should not be a married couple. They should be, or siblings. They should be unrelated. And the reason for unrelated is that there's a legal caveat about compelling family to testify against family. And so that's why you need to have unrelated people in your classrooms. And finally, background checks. How often, who, when, what type. Your policy should indicate who needs to have a background check, how often you're going to do them, when they need to be done, and what type you're going to do. This, again, is something you can do through your insurance company. Almost every insurance company has a partnership with some company that does background checks. They will be happy to help you connect with them. I know Church Mutual works with First Advantage, and that those are things that, you can get a reduced rate for that. They also provide you with sample forms to fill out, and they provide you with a suggestion of how often and everything. Best practice is 36 months. Every 3 years, you should recheck everyone. Some people push it to 5 years. We do it at 3 years here in the district. It's just best practice, and that saves you a lot of headache. The WHO is technically anyone who comes in contact and is in a position of authority with children or youth should be background checked. Now, if you've got 2 background check teachers in a classroom and you have a visitor coming in to do, maybe you have an artist in your class, in your congregation who's going to come in and do a one-day thing with the kids, and they're going to be there in the room with 2 adults at all times, then that you could probably not have to background check that person. You'd be okay. But then again, if you did background check them, you'd be covered. So you need to kind of take a look at what's the context and what's the contact they're going to have. And what type, there's a number of different types. You can do specifically sexual offender. You can do all sorts of kind. They range in price. You can do fingerprint checks. Part of that may be governed by your state laws, so you do need to check those. But I can tell you in Ohio, I do the standard national database check for all misdemeanor and felony charges. It's not even convictions. It tells you if there's a charge, and then it tells you whether or not they were convicted of the charge. And it will also tell, which will bring up sexual predators as well. We also double check everybody in the free state database for sexual predators and offenders. So that's a double way to check it. If you do some very specific, for example, if you do the sexual predator checks, depending on the company you're working with, they may only check the county you're in or the state you're in. So you may miss if they were convicted or charged elsewhere. So you need to, that's why we do the other check, the national database check. But again, your insurance company can give you guidelines and help you navigate that piece. And path back up.
Oh, yeah, so we're definitely throwing a lot of information at you tonight. So, take a deep breath. And are there any questions for Beth about some of these basic kind of guidelines and basic considerations before I move on to talk a little bit about kind of a broader policy and policy that's more comprehensive for the whole congregation? All right. Well, don't be afraid. There's only, we're a small group, so if you have some questions, feel free to jump in. So we're going to talk a little bit about creating a safe congregations policy. If you have a policy, I hope that it's basically less than 10 years old, and a policy really probably needs to be looked at every 5 years, just to be sure that it's in compliance with the latest best practice or latest specific guidelines that are out there. A great resource that is actually over 10 years old but is still a really accessible and appropriate resource is the Safe Congregation Handbook. Many congregations have a copy of this sitting on a shelf. It is also available for a free download to anybody. You can get this on uua.org. Just jump on uua.org and use the site search to find the Safe Congregations Handbook. I think our slides at the end, we also have a link to that, which we can share with you. Whoops, the slide's not moving. Here we go. So, the bottom line is every congregation should have a comprehensive safe congregations policy. It's good business, it's good practice, it's good covenantal behavior. It also is something that can help protect you in a liability situation. So there are very few reasons not to have a safe congregations policy. Something that is really important is to make sure that the leadership understands that, hey, this is not just an RE problem. Certainly, our children are really important to us, and it feels like they are really, really vulnerable in, the world's a big, scary place for our children. But the fact of the matter is there are plenty of other folks that are vulnerable in our congregations. And we need to be thinking more broadly about how we create a culture of safety within our congregational home. So one of the first things that you want to do is to create a safe congregations committee. And this should be a standing committee of the board, something that is always in operation, because it's not something that where we just do it, we create a policy and then it goes away. The Safe Congregations policy has a life cycle that includes doing some needs assessment, understanding where we are, what kind of procedures or guidelines do we have in place, or do we have an existing policy? How old is it? When was the last time we reviewed it? And so their work starts there, to updating or creating policy, to enforcing, implementing, making sure that the policy continues to be an important part of how we engage with one another in our communities. Policy should include a number of different things. Some of the key things that I want to lift up is that there should be very very explicit guidelines around background checks, whatever screening procedures we have, whether we're reference checking our volunteers or whether we're doing background checks for teachers and volunteers with our children and youth program, whether it's signing a code of ethics, or it may just be just a simple form where we ask people to I guess it's the code of ethics form, is just where we ask them to sort of conduct themselves in a safe and covenantal way. A policy should also be focused on our employees, all of our employees, not just employees that come in contact with children, because as Beth pointed out, kids get around. Kids interact in many different ways. So kids are not just connected to people in the RE community, the RE side of the congregation. They may interact with the minister. They may interact with a sexton or custodial staff. They may interact with administrative staff. So everybody who works for the congregation should be subject to some kind of screening. And the policy needs to have some really explicit direction for how we respond to incidents that are reported to the committee. There needs to be a process whereby people can say, this happened, I felt uncomfortable about this, someone's behavior was inappropriate for this reason. So there needs to be a very specific process for that. Whoops. If you go on to uua.org or if you look at some sample policies which we can provide for you or are available on uua.org, there are a number of different forms that congregations have access to. You can also find these forms somewhere like Church Mutual or whatever your insurance company is. They will often make sample forms available to you. But you should be using a reference check form. There should be, again, the code of ethics. Voluntary disclosure. Folks who are working with children may want to disclose past issues, people who are working with youth. So there are a number of different forms that are available to you that can be appended to a policy. And the policy should address when these forms are used, who the forms are, who owns those forms, that is, who is responsible for acting on the information that comes in from those forms. So if somebody were to make a disclosure, or if somebody were to complete a reference check, how is that information handled? who maintains custody of that information. If you're doing background screening, every background screening form or application that I've ever seen requires a Social Security number. So once those applications are completed, there needs to be a locked cabinet in which to keep the applications and also to complete to secure the reports that come back. We owe it to the folks that are volunteering for us, that are acting as volunteer staff for us. We owe it to them to protect their information. And every congregation should have a locked filing cabinet. It might be where the personnel records are kept. It may not be in the RE department. It may not be in the religious educator's office, but there should always be access to a locked cabinet of some kind. Same thing goes with medical consent forms. That's privileged information. That's personal and privileged information. We are not subject to the HIPAA laws in the same way that a doctor's office or a hospital might be, but we do have an obligation and responsibility to safeguard any information we receive, confidential information we receive about someone's health. This is just a grab from the Church Mutual screen, some of the resources that are available through Church Mutual. And we used to everybody could go on and this stuff was all very openly available. But now, if you are not with Church Mutual, we have another resource, another place that you can look for some of these things. But if you do have Church Mutual, they have some really good, high quality resources, good forms, good sample policies. It's not fully comprehensive, and everything needs to be tailored to your own situation, but it's nice to have a place to start. So when you after you've done, as part of the conversation around creating policy or reviewing a policy, you want to think about the various aspects of safety within your congregation. Beth talked about some of these things, just sort of iterating that there are physical safety concerns that you want to think about in your facility, your physical space, playground, electrical safety. How are we safeguarding the well-being of everyone in our congregation by having a safe roof structure, by having sidewalks that are unimpeded or sidewalks that don't have cracks and places where people can trip and fall. Properly sized furniture. And this goes both ways. It's so interesting because I was just talking with someone today who was an elder, and we were talking about some of the barriers to success of the RE program in her congregation. And she said, all of our adult programs take place in the children's wing. And it's all this little tiny furniture. And you have all these folks who are elders, who are older folks, and they can't get up and down, and, it's really not comfortable or safe for them. So sometimes we think about the kids at the big table. Well, sometimes it's the big adults at the little furniture. We also want to think about things, one of the things that can be a significant issue in congregations that we really don't pay a lot of attention to is food handling. Many of our congregations, people bring food in from home. They bring it in a hot crock pot where it's been sitting all night. Maybe they've unplugged it and it sits for several hours before it's plugged back in for the potluck. And so there are a lot of concerns, health concerns and safety concerns around how we handle food. Some congregations have policies around that. Some congregations that just, doesn't even pop into their heads that might be something they need to think about. Policies around the use of kitchen equipment. I know that in my own home congregation, we have commercial stoves and a commercial venting system and fire suppression in the kitchen, and anybody who is part of on the kitchen staff, set up or clean up staff for an event, needs to have particular training, because those things are a little bit complicated, knowing how to turn off the fire suppression or when to turn on the venting system. So these are aspects of training, of safety training, that sometimes just they don't come into our heads. Another thing that is really getting a lot of conversation right now is the issue of vaccinations, and there's kind of a broader conversation. So there's a conversation in our society at large about vaccinations, and somebody in the earlier webinar today said, well, where do you think it's going? And it's a polarized conversation. It's a conversation that I don't think there isn't a definitive answer yet. I think that as religious educators, we need to do a lot of listening right now to what folks are saying more broadly, and also what folks in our congregations are saying. And this is where a place where I think that Venn diagram about, kind of what's required legally of us, what does our moral framework tell us, and what is our covenantal responsibility to one another. And so as we have that conversation around vaccinations, the thing that's emerging for me personally right now is the conversation around what is our covenant. So a lot of people are focused in on, this is what the schools require, and we should require this. But it's also what promises have we made to create a safe space for one another. So, tricky conversations, very alive conversations right now. No definitive answer for that right now. But there's a lot of conversation on the listservs and on Facebook. If you're on the Facebook group, you may have seen some of that. So your policy should also consider, as part of your process of looking at a policy, creating a policy, you want to think about how we provide, how we create an emotionally safe space for our children. And for me, one of the key things to think about is down the slide a little bit, where it says our sacred obligation. We have a sacred obligation to nurture the emotional development of our children and our youth. And so being key, significant contributors to that developmental process, we have an obligation, again, obligation is a good word, to see that happens in an appropriate and a safe way. We're going to talk a little bit about power in a few minutes. And we also want to think about how we're making it safe for our children and our youth in particular from a relational sense. And some congregations are either creating separate or including safety, internet and social networking, social media issues in their safe congregations policy. Some are also including issues around peer-to-peer or bullying, cyberbullying in particular, are beginning to include language around that in their safe congregations policies. There's a good sample policy out there. Actually, the large congregation in Atlanta. Many of you may know Tim Atkins, who's one of our bright stars in young adult DRE dumb. Tim actually was at the Atlanta congregation and was part of creating a social media and internet policy that's very well done. And so that is available as a sample as well. Training should be a really important part of our policy. Policies are not just about enforcement, they're also about preparation. And it's about sort of creating an environment that is conducive to people doing the right thing and making the right decisions. And so training is an important part of that. All volunteers, safety training should be a part of your teacher training, your annual teacher training. In fact, all volunteers really should have some level of safety training. Folks who are greeters in congregations, people are coming in and out of the building, and there could be a fall, there could be any number of things that could happen. And so it's not just volunteers who are working with children and youth, but it's all volunteers, because they're kind of an extension of staff. So they have a certain kind of authority. People will come to if you're sitting at the table, the membership table there on a Sunday morning, and something happens, and somebody's anxious or upset or worried, they're going to look for somebody who looks like they have some authority. And so any volunteer who's in a position where folks where they're seen needs to have that kind of training. Another one, we offer youth advisor training through the districts and the region. That's a really key training. But I also like to lift up the Our Whole Lives training. I know particularly sometimes in smaller congregations where it's hard to get volunteers and it's expensive to get people trained, there's the temptation to say, oh, well, I've got one person trained, and I've got this other guy who's, he took AYS, 15 years ago or 30 years ago, or I know this woman who's a sexuality educator in her day job. And, that's a temptation I would submit that you need to resist, even though it's hard, and I know that there's a real tension there for congregations. But just in terms of from the safety aspect, anybody who is teaching sexuality education should be properly trained. They should have the kind of training that the UUA has created to specifically address the issues, the concerns that might pop up in that training. We talked a little bit about, Beth talked about infants and toddlers. The policy should also address any kind of overnights. So sometimes we have overnights. I'm not talking about cons, even though the slide says overnight mission trips and cons. But congregations sometimes have overnights right on the property. And there ought to be some kind of safety consideration. What are the sleeping arrangements? How many chaperones are required? What kind of training should the chaperones have? That should be covered as part of your teacher training, your volunteer training, and your Safe Congregations policy. One place that some congregations really struggle is the adult behavior when children are present. Again, adults are role models for our young people, and sometimes, we have the potluck or we have the annual auction, and there's a table with free-flowing alcohol, and nobody's even manning the table, and it's a risk. It's a liability risk. It's a relational risk. It's an emotional safety risk. So people need to have conversations around that, because those can become hot button kind of polarizing conversations. Well, I'm an adult. I should be able to drink if I want to drink. And if you don't want us to drink, you're all a bunch of Puritans, which somebody actually said to me. But we need to have some respectful conversations around what are the safety risks there, and what is again, back to that Venn diagram of what are our covenantal obligations to one another. What is the moral framework that we're falling back on when we think about how we include or don't include certain groups? We have many adults in our congregations who are adults in recovery, and how are we, creating an atmosphere that's not is emotionally unsafe for them by having alcohol. I'm not saying you shouldn't have alcohol, but I'm saying that should be part of the conversation of developing a safe congregation policy, comprehensive policy. Okie dokie. So the committee really needs to listen to all complaints, take all comers. Sometimes you have folks who, oh boy, here's Charlie again. But you can't, the committee needs to build credibility. It needs to be an organization it needs to be a piece of the organization that people feel that they can count on. Because if it isn't, if people say, well, I made a complaint about so-and-so, but he's the board president, or he was a founding member, then the whole foundation of safety in your congregation is really put at risk. So all complaints need to be honored. And I'll be honest with you, we have many stories in our congregations about folks who were treasured founding members, board presidents, longtime RE teachers who turned out to be bad characters, who turned out to be engaging in inappropriate or unacceptable behavior. And it's really important that all complaints be considered. The committee needs to be willing and able to maintain confidentiality. People will come and they will, we hear a lot of stories about teachers, and sometimes a teacher's reputation is ruined by a false accusation. And it's the same thing in our congregations. We have to maintain that confidentiality, and the policy should provide for that, should make that clear, that if you want to be a part of the Safe Congregations process, confidentiality is required. So, we wanted to take a quick break, just a stretch break, 2 minutes, and then we're going to come back and talk a little bit about disaster. So get up, stretch, walk around. It's really important. You shouldn't sit in front of a computer for 90 minutes. So we will be back momentarily. Okay, we're back. Some of us are back. So I just want to spend a minute or so talking about mandatory reporting. There are some legal requirements around reporting of suspected child abuse, and it really is different in every state. So we do have a resource that we recommend that you look at to find out what the requirements are in your particular state. I know that in my state of New Jersey and the neighboring state of Pennsylvania, everybody is a mandatory reporter. Clergy are often mandatory reporters. There are some rules around privileged information, privileged communication, that often applies to therapists and doctors, lawyers, and to clergy. But they often are superseded by the legal requirement to protect the vulnerable, to protect children and youth. There are some new laws in Pennsylvania. You both are not in Pennsylvania, so I'm not going to spend any time on that. Just will say that we're working on a webinar for April where we will talk a little bit in more detail about mandatory reporting and some of the legal changes and things like background checks and fingerprinting and that kind of thing. So we'll have some more detail for you on that. So this is from the childwelfare.gov site, and it tells us, where we have some privilege and where everybody is a mandatory reporter. So New York does not have, it does not address the privilege, clergy privilege, and it's been a tricky kind of conversation around religious educators. Do we fall into the clergy camp, or do we fall into the child care worker camp? Because there are some differences in reporting requirements. I would recommend that you perhaps look around your congregation, see if there is a lawyer who is willing to do a little bit of pro bono snooping around to find out what the prevailing law is, because the laws are statewide. They are occasionally more local than that, but that's less often. So it's usually a state law that tells you whether you are required to be a mandatory reporter. Laws will probably also address whether you need to be fingerprinted. I know that in New Jersey, those laws changed within the last 10 years, where even, if you are a PTA volunteer, I was a PTA volunteer in an elementary school and I was fingerprinted. So, Christina's asking, is there a best practice about reporting? Here's that Venn diagram again. There's the intersection of the moral framework, legal requirements, and our covenantal commitments. I think there's some personal reflection and discernment required to answer that question. If I were working with a child and I suspected that there was abuse, for me personally, I would err on the side of caution. I would err on the side of protection. Those laws are called child protection laws. And so that's the way I personally would tip. I can't, we can't give legal advice. There's the disclaimer at the bottom of the thing. Beth, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm also an elementary OWL trainer, and this is actually a topic I cover every time I train. What we tend, and the other thing that can actually affect DREs is that in some states you're considered school superintendents, and school superintendents are mandatory reporters. So you got to figure out how your job's defined. What I tend to tell people is, this would be best practice as far as I'm concerned. Best practice is that you need to report. However, I would also ask that there be a policy in the congregation that when you suspect something, you report it to the DRE or the minister. Because as a congregation, as a covenantal community, as a DRE, I'm going to want to know what's going on so I can create the necessary ministry support for that family as the fallout happens. Whether, even if it's just that family needing our attention and support as they go through this, what can be a very traumatic event. Or even if you go one step further and the perpetrator is also a member of the congregation. I mean, we have all kinds of scenarios there. And so if you can, and my caveat is obviously if this is the minister or the DRE you're dealing with who's potentially being accused, it's a whole different ballgame. But if you're moving, there needs to be a policy that says, before you make that phone call, you're going to call the minister, you're going to call the DRE and say, here's what's going on. Because the other thing I'll often say is that I know for many, many years in this country, certain cultural norms for other cultures were considered potentially abusive. The number one example is family bed. Most Asian cultures practice family bed, which is where the young children, up to potentially as much as 6, sleep with their parents. In this country, it's a little more accepted now. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was thought as a form of child abuse. If a child talks about sleeping with their mother in an AL class, you might go, oh my God. But then if you turned around and talked to the DRE and realized that this family had a cultural background where that is the norm, you would understand. It puts it in context for you. It wouldn't necessarily change your mind, but it would put it in context. So that's why I think sometimes the DRE and the minister are in a position to know more about the family than we are, than an individual volunteer. So I would recommend having a policy that says, here's the chain of command, here's how you do this. But obviously, the end of the day, you have to be able to live with your decision.
Right. And again, the policy, the laws are about the child. So when you're reporting, you're not reporting on, I think so-and-so did something. You are reporting on what you observed was happening to a child. So you're not making an accusation. You are simply lifting up that you saw a child who was possibly in the way of harm, and you leave it to the authorities to sort out the rest. Okay, so we're going to let Beth take a few minutes to take us through disasters.
Okay, disasters. Disasters encompass everything. They encompass tornadoes, fires, earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, just about everything you can imagine. I actually had a conversation with someone the other day saying, oh, you don't live in an earthquake zone, you don't live in California, and I hate to tell you this, but now the fracking's around. Anyone who lives in a fracking area is in an earthquake zone. We've had 2 earthquakes in the part of Ohio I live in since fracking started 2 years ago. So basically the entire Central East region is considered earthquake country now, believe it or not. In my area, we even have to worry about mine subsidence. So, there's all sorts of things you might have to worry about. So you should have a plan, a disaster and evacuation plan that encompasses all these things. Obviously, in a fire, your plan is to get everybody out of the building. In an earthquake or a tornado, there's different things you do. So you need to obviously have plans for each of these different things. An evacuation plan and posted maps are important. So, have maps up so people know how to get out. Think about it. You go into a hotel, there's a map on the back of the door. It tells you where to go to get out. You need to pay particular attention to getting out with infants, toddlers, and anyone with accessibility issues. I consulted with the church one time. They had a great plan. They had a crib that had wheels on it. In the nursery, they were going to put the babies in the crib and the toddlers, and the 2 teachers would roll it down the hallway. Nobody thought about the fact that there was a flight of stairs at the end of that hall to get out the door. And they weren't going to be able to carry that crib down the hall. So you need to think about, could 2 people actually manage 6 toddlers or 12 toddlers? I mean, it's a 1-to-6 ratio with toddlers to get them out of the building. Possibly, possibly not. You may need to think about that in terms of how do you get those kids out. You should do drills. You should do fire drills. You should do all kinds of drills. Drills for all types of disasters help educate people what to do. Here's the classic example. My kids, because I live in Ohio and the entire state of Ohio is required to do tornado drills in their school systems, even though I live on the mountainside and we don't have tornadoes over here usually. When my daughter went to college and later graduate school, she knew what to do when the tornado sirens went off because she had had it ingrained in her through all these drills, through all these years of school of what you do and where to go when when that situation happened. So, this is safety that extends beyond your congregation. And the other thing to think about is asking your local services, emergency services, your fire department, your police department, to come assess your facility and your evacuation and safety plans, disaster plans. They will do this usually for no charge, and they're going to do it for 2 reasons. One is that it's an opportunity for them to walk into your facility and take a look at it and get a feel for what they're dealing with. A school, they have complete access to. A church is a private building, so they don't have complete access to it whenever they want. They're also going to want to know what your plan is so that when they roll up to the front door, they know what to expect. So there's a cooperation there. And they can give you great advice about, you know what, that's not the greatest idea, you should do this instead. So that's another really great resource in your community. And I would strongly recommend that congregations consider becoming a resource for disaster planning in your congregation. You can provide maps, personal survival kits, and brochures for your congregants that tell them how to prepare for things. You can sponsor disaster trainings, blood drives, and other drills to help your community. There are all kinds of ways you can do this. And again, it's a benefit. If you're already doing this work in your own congregation, it's an extension of that, and it's a way we become a public service. So here's some resources for disaster. And I will tell you that I did a special training a number of years ago for the UUA on intruders. Intruders is another area that's a hot topic of conversation lately. I want to point out that an intruder, what do you do with an intruder? And there's two schools of thought. There's the get out of the building and out of the way as fast as you can out of the line of fire. And there's the lockdown, which is what all our schools do. Lockdown to lock all the doors so that the intruder can't get into different rooms. The training I went to advocated if you knew where the person was and you knew you could get out without going past them, then you should get out because you have better chances if you're out of the building. If you couldn't get out safely or you didn't know where the intruder was, then you should go into a lockdown mode. And obviously that then means you need to think about where people are going to hide in that case. So if you have questions about that, please feel free to contact me because I am the person who has that background in our region. But here's some other resources. The Red Cross is a tremendous resource. Their website has all sorts of disaster planning information. The UUA resources has some stuff there. They also have stuff about flu and how to control the flu in your congregation. The CERG safety page, we have a safety page on the CERG website that has some basically links to all of these resources. Church Mutual, we've talked about. If you have their insurance, you can access their stuff. The Centers for Disease Control has a disaster planning section called emergency.cdc.gov. There's a website that the government set up a number of years ago called ready.gov that has a lot of stuff on it. And Brotherhood Mutual is another insurance company. Now, I'm going to tell you, they specialize in insuring megachurches, so you have to kind of translate some of the language. But they still keep all their resources out in the open, and they actually have an Ask the Lawyer type thing where you can ask lawyers general classes, or questions. So that's another resource if you don't have Church Mutual you can go to. And then the American Family Safety Group has a website with other stuff. Pat just mentioned that ALICE is a protocol being used in middle and high schools. It's an acronym to help people remember, alert, lockdown, inform, counter, and evacuate. So there's another piece to help you think about that. And Pat's up next.
This is just a follow-up to Beth's presentation on disaster and sort of more serious kinds of situations. The UUA does have a trauma response team. It was created after 9/11. There was a group of ministers and trauma specialists and folks who came together to support the work that was happening in Lower Manhattan after 9/11, and they have continued that work. And they will go to a site of any kind of trauma or disaster. They will send a team out. They will do pastoral care. They will help with some of the logistical pieces. They will connect with other service agencies to help people get stabilized after some kind of a trauma or a disaster. So that's another resource that's available to you. I want to just lift up. We're running short on time, but I want to spend a few minutes talking about sexually healthy congregations. We have some long history of congregations that have had some deep and long-lasting wounds that came from inappropriate sexual misconduct on the part of leaders, on the part of staff, on the part of ministers. some of those kinds of incidents cause the deepest wounds that a congregation can sustain. So there's been some really good work done in the last, definitely in the last few years, but also beyond that. Deborah Hafner, we're so blessed to have Deborah Hafner of the Religious Institute. She's a community minister, a Unitarian Universalist community minister. Her work is in sexuality, education, prevention, and she has created some fabulous tools for congregations. She has created the sexual health assessment that congregations can use. It's a free resource on uua.org, and it is basically it's kind of a step-by-step guide, and it looks at these 9 different possible circumstances in your congregation. There are things for you to assess. You can use this if you're creating a safe congregations policy. You can use this as part of your needs assessment, your assessment process before you update or create a policy. It addresses, as you can see, I hope you can read that, it addresses policies, it addresses the sexual health of religious professionals, pastoral care, sexuality education for all ages, and Safe Congregations is also a part of this assessment. So each section, each one of the building blocks has, kind of a check sheet where you can answer questions about what kind of policies you have. Do you have a policy? Do you provide certain training? Do you offer OWL training for a variety of different ages? So depending on which one of the building blocks you're looking at, the questions relate to helping you understand where you are. It's an assessment. Where are we? What is the kind of work that we need to be doing to make sure that we're protecting our community and that we're also growing in our understanding and our willingness to engage with one another around the topic of sexuality. One of the things that often I get contacted by, I'm kind of a Safe Congregations conduit within CERG, so many of the conversations, if folks are asking the UUA for advice or some kind of counsel on what to do about particular situations, that often funnels back to me. And one of the most common questions I get is about sexual offenders. We have someone in our congregation, either somebody new to our congregation who has self-disclosed that they are a sexual offender, or somehow they know that that person has some kind of a criminal background, or it's somebody who has been a member, sometimes even a long-time prominent member, who has recently been convicted of some kind of a sexuality related offense. So there's a great resource. Deborah Hafner, again, created something called Balancing Acts. It walks you through some of the questions, some of the policies, how to include a sexual offender in your congregation, how to create a limited access agreement, how to create allies for this person. Sadly, the statistics do not support successful sort of re-engagement of a sexual offender in a congregation. Most of the time, those relationships are not long-lasting. But it's again, this is the Venn diagram of our moral obligation and our legal obligation and our covenantal obligation. There are tensions there, and there are conversations that every congregation needs to have for themselves about how they are going to be guided and whether they are willing and able to take a sexual offender into the community, and how that might work. Particularly when thinking about sexuality-related concerns in this conversation around safety, one of the issues to think about is power, and many sexual assaults, offenses related to inappropriate sexual conduct are less about the physical aspect of sex and more about power and control. And so it's an interesting chart. It's in the Safe Congregations Handbook that by Frederick Muir and Patricia Hordorfer. So that's a resource that's available to you. But it may be something that's useful in your conversation around safe congregations. There are some resources that we want to lift up. We've mentioned several of them already. The Safe Congregation Handbook, and I can send you both this PowerPoint, so you'll have those links right at your fingertips. There is the Safe Congregations Handbook, as I said, and it has some workshops. It has some essays that you can share in the congregation as part of the conversation, part of the educational process that goes on. Church Mutual is a wonderful resource, assuming that they are your insurer. Balancing Acts by Deborah Hafner, I strongly recommend if you are dealing with anybody in your community who might be a sexual offender. There also is stuff in there about youth-adult relationships that I think is important as well. There are staffing forms, there are codes of ethics, there are lots of sample forms on uua.org, and then there is the sexual health assessment, which I think is a great tool. That's relatively new. That's something that's been added in the last year or two. So I recommend that to you. Any questions? Gosh, we've got a couple minutes left, and Beth and I have been blabbing away, and I know it's a lot of information. Is there anything immediate that comes to mind, knowing that Beth and I will continue to be available to you as resources in this area? Yeah, that's. I like that comment, Carol. Yeah, a lot of things to talk about. A lot of. I hope that your eyes have been open to some areas where some good, healthy dialogue is needed. So that's a good response. All right. Well, it's 8:29. Beth, do you have any last words?
Nope. I think we've covered it all, or as much as we can.
I think that we have. And I appreciate that you two were with us tonight.